So let's talk about making offers and counter offers. Obviously, this is going to be another big part of what we do as real estate agents. We're going to be writing up these offers, submitting the offers. But then, before we even really get too far into this, I do want to clarify something that a lot of veteran agents, I think, are kind of misunderstanding or missing what I want to go over real quick. There is a difference between making an offer and negotiating, or making a counter offer, rather, probably more so making a counter offer and negotiating. If you're representing a seller, for example, and you get in and you receive an offer, then obviously as the agent, then you need to review the offer and determine, does this offer meet what my seller has already told me they expect or what they require from the sale? If it does, if it meets all the requirements, then obviously you go ahead and submit the offer or go over it with the seller. But what if it doesn't? What if your seller's already told you, and these are things that are common discussions that you should have with your client. But for example, the seller might say, well, I would like to get $250,000 for the property. So I'll agree to list it for $250,000. But $240,000, that's my bottom line. I cannot go less than $240,000. Now, obviously, as the seller's agent, I'm going to try to get $250,000 or even more if that's possible. I want to try to get as much as we can because I'm trying I'm working in the best interest of the seller. So why is it important to know what the bottom line is for the seller? Because you got to be able to negotiate, and you got to have some parameters in which to negotiate. Now, am I going to share it with the buyer that my seller would be willing to accept $240,000? Certainly not right away, right? Because we asked $250,000 and that's what we want. But let's say again we would like $250,000, but maybe it comes back. We get an offer for $240,000. Which we know is the least my seller would consider. The problem is, as we look further through the offer, we see the buyer's asking for additional things. It's going to cost the seller more money. Maybe they're asking the seller to pay $5,000 in closing costs for the buyer. Maybe they're asking the seller to pay for a home warranty, and which could be several hundred, maybe $500. Stuff like that. So when you do a net sheet, basically to figure out, based on this offer, how much will my seller net if they accept this offer, we find out it's going to be much less than $240,000. It might be closer to $233,000 or $234,000 or something like that. So we're $5,000, $6,000, maybe $7,000 off of what my seller said they want to net. Well, in my opinion, there's no reason at this point to just send that offer to the seller. Seller's already said this is not going to work. So as the agent, we need to negotiate. At this point, we know we're off. Let's just say we're off $5,000. And the buyer, part of their offer was they're asking for $5,000 in closing cost. Here's what tends to happen, and I see this all the time in real estate, is the seller's agent, they'll just recommend to the seller, they've offered you the $240,000, which you said you would be willing to accept. But the closing cost of $5,000, that's what's going to kind of mess things up. So why don't we just counter back? We'll go ahead, we'll accept the $240,000, but we're not paying the $5,000 in closing costs. Then that puts you back up to where you need to be in order to close. And so the seller typically is going to take the advice of their agent, go ahead and make that counteroffer. Y'all, I'm going to tell you, when you do stuff like that, in this, especially with this scenario, chances are you've just killed the deal. Good chance you just countered the one thing the buyer could not do. Because y'all, the buyer's lender may have already told the buyer the seller will have to pay $5,000 in closing costs for you in order for this loan to work. Well then, you know what? That's not something that's negotiable. Either seller, you must pay this, or it ain't going to happen, right? So now you just countered the one thing that's going to kill the deal. What we should be doing instead is, it's called negotiating. The seller's agent needs to contact the buyer's agent and just say, hey, look, we got your offer. Thank you so much. We appreciate the offer. We do have to do a little bit of work here to get the numbers to work out for both sides. And agent, I see where your buyer is asking for $5,000 in closing cost. How critical or how big a deal is that to the buyer? Because we're going to have to we're going to have to make a counter. We're just trying to get the numbers right, where it'll work for everybody, right? Well, then the buyer's agent says, Frankie, the seller has to pay that. The lender's requiring it, and if they don't agree to pay those closing costs, then they can't get the loan. So that's critical. Well, then guess what? Seller, we have to pay these costs for this contract to work. So we can't counter the closing cost. Well, is there something else we could do? All right. Well, how about instead of the sales price being the $140, we go to $145? Do you think that's something your buyer would be willing to do? And they said, well, yeah, they could pay a little bit more. They'll probably be okay with the $145 as long as the seller pays the $5,000 in closing costs. See, that's negotiating, right? And that's what you have to do. I don't even know how agents decide to make a counter offer before they've negotiated. Because you may be countering the one thing that's going to kill the deal when there are other ways potentially to make both sides happy. So that's the job of the two agents when it comes to negotiating, is to let's see if we can figure out how to make the numbers work for both sides. Now it may be that it's just not going to work. Okay, buyer, if you're not willing to pay or able to pay more, then maybe you can't afford this house. Okay, and sometimes we just need to go ahead and acknowledge this is not going to work. But you shouldn't just make that statement or come to that decision before you've at least tried to negotiate in a way to make both sides happy. The reason I'm going over this, or talking about the negotiation part, is because I hear agents tell me, in fact, if you look at this first bullet here, it says all offers, and when they say offers, that includes counteroffers, must be presented in writing promptly. Because we know everything has to be in writing. So they're saying, so we can't really discuss things until we put it in writing. So we have to make the counteroffer in writing before we, no. Negotiating is not an offer, okay? As the seller's agent, I don't have the authority to tell the buyer what my seller would be willing to accept. What I'm trying to find out through negotiation is what would the buyer be willing to do, or potentially be willing to do. The buyer's agent cannot commit to anything either. We're just between agents. We're trying to discuss some possibilities that might work for both parties. So you really need to negotiate these things between the two agents, try to figure out the best scenario. And then once you come to an agreement in terms of, I think this would work for the buyer. The seller's agent's thinking, I think this will work for the seller. Let's go back and talk to each of our clients and see if we can get this to work. And assuming the seller agrees with it, then we can make that counter offer. So we'll leave the closing costs there because the buyer needs it, but we'll just increase the sales price by that amount. And then hopefully the buyer's okay with that too. But when it comes to the actual offer or counter offer itself, now that has to be in writing, and the law says you must promptly deliver the offers. Because here's the next thing you better understand. If you're representing the seller, let's say you present the offer to them, and the seller says, "I'll accept the offer. We're good to go there." But say it's a couple of hours later before the agent has a chance to get back to the buyer's agent. Well, the law does also state, as it says in the second bullet, the buyer, they can rescind their offer. They can withdraw their offer, and without penalty at any at any time prior to notification of acceptance. So if you're that seller's agent and you're procrastinating, or you're putting off notifying the buyer or their agent that the offer's been accepted, you're giving that buyer time to rescind their offer and walk away without penalty. And I promise you, if that happens, and now you got to go back to tell your seller, well, I didn't get the offer to them in time, or the acceptance rather, in time, and the buyer got cold feet and backed out, and there's nothing we can do about it. I promise you, your seller's not going to be happy with you. So what you should be doing, at the moment the seller says they're accepting the offer, then you need to notify the buyer's agent, we have accepted your offer. Now, I may not be able to send you the signed contract at that moment. It might be an hour. It might be a couple of hours. Maybe I got to get back to the office or whatever to be able to send it to you. But basically, you just need to let them know the offer's been accepted, and I will get you a copy of the written acceptance, within the next hour or 2 hours or whatever the case may be. But that notification of acceptance is critical, because once you've notified them, the law says notification can be by any way you can show you actually notified them has been accepted. So if I send them a text, or I generally like to call, but you can text them, email them, or whatever. But any way you can show that you did notify them that we're accepting the offer. At that point, the buyer can no longer withdraw their penalty or withdraw or rescind their offer without penalty. Okay. When we say penalty, they could lose their earnest money. We'll talk more about earnest money here in a little bit, but all that's important. All this stuff has to be done promptly. You cannot procrastinate when we're dealing with these legal issues. Okay. You also notice here it says if you do make a counter offer, we've talked about this a good bit. Remember, if we make a counter offer, one, that puts the contract in a voidable state, because it could not be voided by the other party. But the other thing that counter offer does, that terminates the original offer. Now get that. You have now terminated anything up to that point. So in other words, seller, don't try to play games here, because I'm telling you, a lot of sellers, they'll say, well, let's counter back and try to increase the price by X amount. And if for some reason they say no, then we'll just accept their original offer. you can't go back to, everything up to that point you've now terminated. You can't say, well, accept something that's been terminated. No. So again, make sure your clients understand the effects, the legal effects of making a counter offer. Obviously, if you need to make a counter offer, make it. But just understand there's no going back. Okay? You can't back up from that point. And then the last thing you see here on this slide, I was talking about a postal rule. That's a very antiquated method, to say the least. But it still exists, so I just want to make sure you know what it is, potentially for test purposes. But now, can we email offers, acceptances, contracts and stuff? Can we email it, fax it and stuff like that? Yes, and those are legal, okay? There's nothing wrong with that. But there was a time when email was not possible. Faxing was not possible. So if you could not basically hand deliver the offer, then you would have to mail it to someone. And based on this postal rule, at the moment the offer or acceptance was put in the mail, then that's considered notified as well. In other words, buyer, you cannot rescind your offer because you haven't received it in the mail yet. So, excuse me. So if that buyer does try to rescind or get out of it, and we find that the date and time they notified you that they want to rescind it, if that was after the date on the envelope where it was postmarked, then buyer, you can't get out without penalty. That's the postal rule. That shouldn't be something I couldn't imagine that's the way you'd be dealing with these contracts today by mail. But anyway, that's the postal rule. And then finally, we need to talk about the potential of multiple offers. And hopefully you understand what we're talking about there. Is it possible you put the house on the market and within a short amount of time you receive 2 offers or 3 offers or 4 offers? That's what we're talking about here. You've got multiple offers. Now what? What do you do with all these offers? Well, first of all, that could be a test question. How must you handle multiple offers? And the way the law reads, and by the way, this would be the answer you need to answer with, multiple offers must be handled in any manner in which the owner and the agent had agreed to. So obviously this is something the agent, the seller's agent, and the seller should have discussed before we put the house on the market. You might say, look, seller, let's talk about the potential of what are we going to do if we receive multiple offers. Because there's any number of ways to handle it. It's just that the agent and the seller should have already agreed on how we're going to handle it, before it happens. I will tell you probably the most, excuse me, probably the most common way seems to be that say we got 3 offers, then we'll just notify all 3 buyers or their agents that we now have multiple offers. If you would like to make a better or a best and final offer, you hear it called a lot of times, then we're going to give you 24 hours or 48 hours, however much time you decide you want to give them, to make a best and final offer. But at the end of that 24 hours or 48 hours, then we're going to select whichever offer we believe to be the best offer. That seems to be the most common way, typical way it seems to be handled, but it doesn't have to be. I may have 3 offers on the table. Could the seller just say, you know what, I like this one, and I'm just going to accept this offer? Yes, Yeah. So do I have to notify all other parties that we now have multiple offers and give them the opportunity to make a higher offer? You don't have to. What does the law say? I can handle multiple offers in any manner the owner and the listing agent agreed upon. And what we agreed upon was I'm going to just select whichever offer is the best offer when you submit it. Occasionally you'll hear agents, I've had this happen, where I've had agents contact me and say, well, you never told me there was multiple offers. We could have made a higher offer. And they get mad at me, like they want to file a complaint against me. Okay, well, go ahead. We handled it in the way that me and my seller decided we wanted to handle it. Now, again, I think most of the time most will just notify each party and let them know that you got an opportunity to make a higher or best and final offer. But you don't have to do it that way. That's the only point I want to make is just make sure you and your seller have agreed. Here's how we're going to handle multiple offers if it should happen. Okay? So I think that's most of what you need to understand about making offers and counter offers and how to handle multiple offers.